You wake in darkness. Not your bed. Not your room. Stone walls press in around you, damp with age. The smell hits first: sweat, candle wax, something rotting under the surface. You hear murmurs outside the heavy wooden door. Footsteps. A chorus of voices too calm for what's about to happen. The door creaks open. Torchlight spills into the chamber. A dozen faces, strangers, nobles, priests, enter as if they have every right to be here. You feel cold hands unlace your garments. They're not yours anymore. You are led to the bed like a witness being marched to the gallows. A man stands across from you, equally stripped of dignity. He won't meet your eyes. And why would he? In a few moments, these people, judges, family members, clergy, will stand in silence and watch you consummate your marriage. No privacy. No choice. Just duty. One of the witnesses unfolds a white sheet and lays it gently on the bed, not for comfort, but for evidence. You hear a voice whisper, "There must be blood. This is not a nightmare. This is a wedding. And this was normal." Forget what you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. The myths of chastity, purity, restraint, they were lies. Hidden behind cathedral walls and castle gates were rituals so grotesque, so twisted, they'd make your worst Tinder date look like a nun in confession. Welcome to the History Scar. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. You're not ready for what comes next. You wake the next morning, not to silence but to footsteps. Someone's coming to check the bed. You're still sore. The linen beneath you is creased, damp with sweat, and, most importantly to them, stained red. That blood? It's your ticket to legitimacy. In the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a virtue. It was a form of currency. A girl's honor, her family's reputation, even the legal validity of her marriage, was tied to a single moment of bleeding on white cloth. It didn't matter if you were in pain. It didn't matter if you were afraid. It didn't even matter if it was your first time. What mattered was blood. That single mark on linen could decide your future, or destroy it. No blood. You were a fraud. A liar. Maybe even a whore. At best, the marriage was questioned. At worst, it was annulled and you were sent back in disgrace, your name ruined forever. Families would sometimes hide these failures, burning the sheets or even bribing servants to claim they'd seen blood. But rumors spread fast. In villages and courts alike, everyone wanted to know, was she pure? The pressure was enormous. Some brides faked the evidence. There were women, desperate women, who smuggled vials of pig's blood into the wedding chamber, tucked into cloth, hidden in sleeves. They'd drip it onto the sheets while the groom slept or was too drunk to notice. It worked, sometimes. But if caught, the punishment could be brutal. Fraud, deception, defiling a holy union. And yes, there were doctors. Not modern surgeons, but back-alley herbalists and backdoor physicians who offered surgical restorations of virginity. Stitching the hymen. Tightening the vaginal canal. Dangerous, painful, unsanitary procedures performed in secret. The idea was to mimic the tightness of a virgin body. A fantasy. A lie. But one that could mean the difference between being a wife or being discarded. Because virginity wasn't just about you. It belonged to your father, your brothers, your husband. Your body was their contract, your blood the seal of the deal. In noble families, alliances rested on that sheet. Land, power, property, it could all collapse if the bride failed to bleed. And let's be clear, the science was never there. We know today that not all women bleed the first time. Some never do. The hymen isn't a seal. It doesn't break. But medieval people didn't care. The myth was stronger than reality. Stronger than your truth. In some places, families would even parade the sheets through the streets the morning after. A servant would hold up the stained linen as proof that the marriage had been honored. People clapped, cheered, laughed. It was a public celebration of your most private moment. It didn't stop there. There were virginity tokens sold in towns. Little red-inked cloths you could hide in your bedding. Some even came with scents to mimic the smell of blood. Merchants made a living off the lie. Churches blessed these cloths. No one talked about it out loud, but everyone knew. Virginity was a game. One you had to play to survive. And then there were the girls who didn't make it. Girls taken before marriage. Victims of abuse. Widows forced into remarriage who had to pretend to be virgins again. They were often the ones buying those tokens. Bribing physicians. Risking everything to bleed again. And no, this wasn't just for peasants. Even queens faced this scrutiny. Royal brides underwent inspections before the wedding. Female relatives, midwives, sometimes even clergy examined them, spread open on tables under candlelight, to confirm their so-called purity. Imagine that, your royal status meaning nothing if your hymen didn't pass a test written by men who had never seen one. Some noble families, terrified of embarrassment, sent their daughters to be tested in secret beforehand. If she failed, she'd vanish from records. Married off to a distant cousin, hidden in a convent, written out of the family history. This obsession with virginity wasn't just cultural, it was legal. A marriage could be annulled if the bride wasn't a virgin. That meant land would return to her father, alliances could break, kingdoms could fall. Your body could cause a war. And no one asked the men. No groom was inspected. No one looked for blood on his sheets. No one questioned his purity. Male infidelity was whispered about. Sometimes even celebrated. But a woman? One mistake, one night, one tear in the myth, and your life was over. If this already made your jaw drop, you owe it to yourself to subscribe. This is what the History Scar does. We dig where it hurts. If you're not subscribed, what are you even doing here? Enlighten yourself. Because what you've just heard was only the beginning. And what comes next will leave you questioning everything you thought was sacred. You were told the monasteries were holy places. Silent corridors. Stone floors. Men and women in robes, heads bowed in prayer, untouched by the world. That's what people believed. That's what the church wanted them to believe. But behind closed doors, far from the eyes of the flock, there was a different kind of devotion. Some monks didn't just break their vows. They burned through them. Medieval church records are filled with scandals that were never meant to be public. Monks caught in bed together. Nuns sneaking through garden walls to meet lovers in secret. Confession booths that turned into meeting spots for affairs. These weren't rare cases. They were documented over and over, ignored by bishops, buried by scribes, but preserved in the margins of forgotten manuscripts. In some monasteries, entire groups of nuns were found pregnant. Not once, not twice, but year after year. The church sent investigators. The results were humiliating. One report from 14th century Germany found that the abbess herself had been arranging secret meetings between her nuns and local priests. The nuns called it spiritual companionship. The abbess called it God's mercy. They weren't the only ones playing games with definitions. A growing number of monks and nuns entered what they called spiritual marriages. Technically, they didn't break their celibacy vows. Spiritually married couples claimed they didn't sleep together. But the letters they left behind said otherwise. Dozens of letters have survived, written in Latin, tucked inside prayer books, where nuns describe in detail the desires they felt for fellow monks. Some even wrote about God as if he were a jealous husband, apologizing to him for choosing the body of another man over divine love. Some monasteries tried to manage the chaos quietly. They built small side buildings known as guest houses, just outside monastery grounds. Officially, they were for traveling clergy. Unofficially, they were used for secret rendezvous. Lay brothers, servants, and local townspeople all became part of the cycle. A monk would sneak out at night. A nun would follow. The forest path between the convent and the abbey was well trodden. Everyone pretended not to see. And when mistakes happened, when pregnancies couldn't be hidden, there were herbal remedies. Abortifacients were illegal under canon law. But midwives, apothecaries, and yes, even some nuns knew how to mix the right roots. Pennyroyal, tansy, rue, mugwort. Dried, crushed, boiled. In some convents, these herbs were grown in gardens hidden from public view. One abbey inventory listed medicinal herbs for women's cycles. Everyone knew what that meant. The church cracked down when it could. But the problem wasn't just moral, it was political. Monasteries held power. They owned land, collected taxes, and held influence. Punishing one monk could anger a local lord. Exposing a convent scandal could ruin alliances. So many crimes were handled internally. Quiet transfers. Forced vows of silence. Sometimes a nun would disappear. Sent to a stricter convent. Or buried quietly in a corner of the graveyard without questions. And then there were the same-sex relationships. The church officially condemned sodomy. But monasteries by nature were single-sex spaces. 4 young men entering religious life at 13 or 14, surrounded by older monks, isolated from the outside world, attraction grew. Some gave in. Others tried to confess, only to be punished harshly. Whipped. Shamed. Exiled. One case from 1298 in northern France describes a monk who fell in love with another. When they were discovered, both were imprisoned in their cells for a year. The younger monk didn't survive the punishment. The other, broken by guilt, wrote a letter before dying that read, "I loved him more than I feared God." In nunneries, these relationships were even harder to track. Female same-sex intimacy was less understood and rarely discussed. But there are letters. It's stories of nuns sleeping in the same beds, passing coded messages, using the language of saints to describe physical love. These weren't isolated stories. They were part of a pattern, human desire pushing back against enforced holiness. A world that tried to suppress sex only to become obsessed with it. What shocks you more, the public or the private sins of the clergy? Drop your take in the comments. Because this is what history really looked like. And if the people sworn to celibacy couldn't keep their hands clean, what else do you think they were hiding? You're not going to believe the next chapter. It only gets darker from here. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't just about love or partnership. It was about land, money, bloodlines. And in noble families, it was a legal contract with terms that had to be verified, including the part about sex. You didn't just say, "I do." You had to prove it. In bed. With witnesses. This wasn't symbolic. It was real. Public. Sometimes humiliating. The practice was called the bedding ceremony, and it was as awkward as it sounds. After the wedding feast, the bride and groom were led to the bedroom in full view of the guests. A priest might bless the bed. Guests would cheer. Then the couple would be stripped, sometimes by members of their own families, and laid together under the covers. And that's when the door didn't close. In noble courts across Europe, it was common for important witnesses, family members, clergy, even government officials, to stay in the room. They might stand at the foot of the bed. Some sat in chairs nearby. Others claimed a good view was necessary to confirm the marriage was real. Why? Because a marriage wasn't valid until it was consummated. Sex turned a contract into law. And if the sex didn't happen, or someone claimed it didn't later, it could cost a family everything. That's why nobles watched. They were protecting property, inheritance, alliances. It wasn't about modesty. It was about evidence. Some couples tried to fake it. They'd lie still, move the bed, fake moans, do anything to get it over with. But it didn't always work. In certain courts, the sheets were inspected afterwards, looking for blood, semen, any sign that sex had occurred. And if the bride didn't bleed, it started all over again. There were cases where the act wasn't convincing enough. The man didn't finish. The woman didn't seem pure. Witnesses reported doubts. The result? A second bedding, this time with more people watching. In one documented case from Castile in the 14th century, a noblewoman was forced to perform the act again in front of 6 male witnesses and a notary. They even recorded the angle, the time, and whether the groom completed the deed. It got worse when people started using these rituals as legal weapons. Some families accused their new in-laws of faking the consummation. They filed lawsuits claiming the marriage wasn't valid. Suddenly, bedroom stories turned into legal arguments. Lawyers debated whether an orgasm occurred. Priests gave testimony. Servants were called to describe what they saw or what they thought they saw. One couple in 15th century France had their marriage annulled after the bride's family claimed the groom was unable to perform in front of witnesses. He said he was nervous. They said he was broken. The church sided with the bride. Virginity inspections didn't stop after the wedding. If the groom doubted the bride's purity, he could request a public exam. A midwife or physician would check her body for signs of prior intercourse. If she passed, the marriage continued. If not, she was labeled a fraud. And this wasn't reserved for royalty. Any marriage involving land, titles, or social rank could include some form of proof of sex ceremony. It wasn't about intimacy. It was about control. People today talk about arranged marriages like they were simply unromantic. But in the Middle Ages they were often monitored, witnessed, and judged by others. You didn't just marry someone. You performed for your family. For the state. For the church. You're halfway through and you're still watching. That's not a coincidence. This is the kind of history that changes your view of everything. Tap that subscribe button. Or do you enjoy being the silent lurker who never shows support? Because the truth is, this isn't some forgotten custom. It's a mirror. These ceremonies show how far people would go to control bodies, reputation, and legacy. And if you think bedding ceremonies were the peak of medieval madness, just wait. What they put in their food to boost performance. That's coming next. And it's far worse than you're expecting. Before Viagra, before supplements, before anything resembling modern medicine, there was medieval food. But this wasn't about nutrition. This was about lust. If you were wealthy, your kitchen wasn't just a place for bread and stew. It was your personal sex lab. Across Europe, noble families held secret feasts designed to turn people on. These weren't quiet dinners. They were full-on rituals. Entire menus built around one goal: make sure the newlyweds could perform. Or if you were single, boost your chances of seducing someone before the night ended. The main ingredient? Testicles. Lots of them. Bull testicles, ram testicles, boar testicles. Served roasted, boiled, ground up and mixed with wine. In cookbooks they were called stones, a cleaner word for what everyone knew they were. Nobles believed that eating the genitals of a strong animal would pass that strength into the bedroom. People crushed them into powder, stirred them into honey, or stuffed them inside pastries. It was expensive, but it was popular. The logic was, if it worked for the bull, it might work for me. And they didn't stop at testicles. Some recipes called for sparrow brains. Others used the reproductive organs of deer, or mixed in lizard tails, snake skin, or powdered beetles. It wasn't just meat. Spices played a major role. Cinnamon, ginger, saffron, pepper, all believed to awaken desire. These were rare and costly imports, worth more than silver in some places. People would hoard them just to sprinkle a bit over a dish before a date. One chronicler wrote that a nobleman spent half his inheritance on cinnamon and cloves for a night of success. And it worked, if you believed it did. The church was furious. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was effective. People weren't fasting for God. They were fasting for sex. During Lent, certain aphrodisiacs were banned, not for health reasons, but because they were too lustful. Recipes with almond oil, figs, honey, and pine nuts were blacklisted in convent kitchens. Even basic garlic got flagged in one monastery because it was known to inflame the lower organs. But food was only part of the picture. Magic filled the rest. Before sex, some people performed rituals. Simple spells, whispered prayers, or chants pulled from grimoires. A man might light a candle carved with symbols. A woman might sleep with herbs under her pillow, or rub a talisman between her thighs. These weren't jokes. People believed these rituals changed their bodies. Love potions were even darker. One recipe called for menstrual blood, mixed with red wine and herbs. A woman would serve it to a man, believing it would bind him to her forever. Another required collecting hair and fingernail clippings, grinding them into powder and hiding it in food. The most extreme version involved animal blood and human sweat, left to ferment in the sun. They called it binding magic. The goal was control. Lust that couldn't be broken. Desire that wouldn't fade. The more desperate someone was, the more extreme the recipe. In some regions there were love witches, mostly women, who were hired to cast sex spells or make potions for clients. They promised erections that lasted until sunrise. Or passion that couldn't be ignored. Most worked in secret. Some got rich. Others were caught and punished, accused of sorcery or devil worship. And there were real dangers. Some ingredients were toxic. Mercury. Moldy herbs. A few even used nightshade or henbane, which could cause seizures or hallucinations. People still drank them. If it meant better performance or a better chance at seduction, it was worth the risk. Aphrodisiacs were about power, over your body, your partner, your future. They were used in marriage beds, brothels, and back rooms of castles. Kings took them. Soldiers took them. Even some priests, quietly and off the record, tried them. This wasn't a rare thing. This was part of daily life. And some of these ideas lasted for centuries. You'll still find recipes in old medical texts, listed under foods to inspire carnal heat. They didn't say love. They said heat, because for them, sex wasn't always about emotion. It was about appetite. So now it's your turn. Comment the weirdest medieval aphrodisiac you've heard so far. I dare you. Because if you thought animal genitals and fermented blood drinks were as far as it went, you're going to want to stay for the next chapter. We're not done yet. In the next part, you'll see how the church didn't just allow sin, they built an empire from it. Keep watching. This is about to get worse. You were told the church was the moral compass of medieval Europe, the voice of God on earth, the keeper of purity. But look a little closer and you'll find a different truth, one that wasn't preached from the pulpit. The medieval church didn't just tolerate prostitution. It profited from it. In cities like London, Paris, and Cologne, brothels weren't hidden in back alleys. They were organized, regulated, and in some cases, owned by bishops. The church didn't run these operations out of ignorance. It ran them like a business. Let's take the Southwark district in London. In the 12th century, it became one of the most active red light districts in Europe. And the property? It was owned by the Bishop of Winchester. That's why local prostitutes were called Winchester geese. They didn't work for a private owner. They worked on land controlled by the church. The church charged rent to the brothel keepers. In return, those keepers charged the women fees for room, board, and protection. Then taxes were paid to the bishop's office. Money flowed upward, from the women to the keepers to the clergy. It was a triangle of profit. And it didn't stop there. Priests, monks, and friars weren't just collecting money. Many were customers. There are dozens of written complaints from city officials about clergy being caught visiting brothels in full robes. Some reports even mention priests running side brothels of their own, hiring young women under false promises of safety or redemption. In theory, prostitution was a sin. But the church had an answer ready. Better a man visits a brothel than commits rape or adultery. That was their logic. Prostitution was a necessary evil, a release valve for male lust. Theologians even argued it protected marriage by giving men somewhere else to go. That logic opened the door for full regulation. Local councils, with church approval, created rules for how sex work would be handled. There were inspection days, where women were checked by appointed officials to ensure they weren't spreading disease. These weren't medical exams. They were public, humiliating, and often used as an excuse for abuse. If a woman was found unfit, she could be fined or kicked out. There were dress codes. Prostitutes were often required to wear certain colors, yellow in some places, striped cloaks in others, so they could be easily identified. This was supposed to protect respectable women from being confused with sex workers. In reality, it marked women for mockery, harassment, and violence. Some cities imposed curfews on prostitutes. Others limited where they could walk, who they could speak to, and what they could say in public. These women were taxed, regulated, and constantly watched, but rarely protected. And the money? It went straight into the church's pockets. In Avignon, where the Pope himself resided during the 14th century, the church collected fees from over 20 official brothels. That revenue was used to help fund building projects and even religious festivals. The contradiction wasn't hidden. It was accepted. Church officials even defended the system in writing. One famous quote from a 15th century cleric compared prostitutes to the filth in a sewer: "Remove it and the house overflows." In other words, without them, society would collapse. Women who worked in these brothels had little say. Most were poor. Some were orphans. Others were sold into sex work by their families. A few entered willingly, seeing it as the only way to survive. But once inside the system, leaving was almost impossible. And if a woman got pregnant, she was often thrown out, forced to raise a child alone, or pressured to give it up. The church, while happy to take her labor and her earnings, rarely offered help when she needed it most. If a sex worker died, she couldn't be buried in a Christian cemetery without special permission. Some were buried outside city walls. Others in unmarked graves. Their names were forgotten, even as their work helped fund the very churches that refused to claim them. If you just realized the church might have been Europe's biggest pimp, then maybe it's time you joined the History Scar and subscribed. If you're watching but not subscribing, you're part of the silent scandal. Because this isn't about shaming faith. It's about facing facts. The same institution that preached purity built an economy around sin. And in the next chapter, we'll look at what people did when they didn't want to get pregnant, because the methods they used, they'll make you question everything you think you know about medieval life. Keep watching. You're going to need a strong stomach. In a world obsessed with sex, pregnancy was a consequence many couldn't afford. For married couples, too many children meant poverty. For unmarried women, pregnancy could destroy their future. And for sex workers, it could mean exile, abandonment, or worse. So people turned to what they had: herbs, myths, trial and error, and superstition. And the results were often deadly. Let's start with one of the most bizarre methods recorded: crocodile dung. Women in parts of medieval Europe and North Africa believed it could block pregnancy. They'd shape the dung into small plugs and insert them before sex, thinking it would act like a barrier. No science. Just belief. And the risk of infections, poisoning, or worse. They took it anyway. Then came mercury. Yes, actual mercury, the toxic metal. Some recipes mixed mercury with crushed herbs and wine and told women to drink it. The idea was that it would thin the blood and prevent a fetus from forming. What it really did was destroy organs from the inside. But in a time when medicine was mixed with magic, warnings were rare, and desperation spoke louder than reason. Others tried half a lemon. Not as deadly but not exactly comfortable. The theory was simple: the acidity would kill sperm. Women would hollow out one side, insert it, and hope for the best. It may have worked slightly, but the discomfort, infections, and long-term damage made it far from ideal. Some women were told to sneeze right after intercourse. Doctors in the 13th century genuinely believed that if a woman sneezed with enough force, she could push the man's seed out of her womb. Midwives encouraged this. Women kept pepper nearby to make it happen. That's how serious it was. Induced sneezing as a contraceptive strategy. Other attempts got spiritual. Some women carried conception stones, small polished crystals kept near their bodies during sex. Others wore charms with phrases like, "Closed be my womb until I choose," written in Latin or Old French. These were believed to block pregnancy through divine intervention. They didn't, but people believed they did, which often led to more unprotected sex and more pregnancies. But the most common method, herbal abortifacients, was both widespread and dangerous. You won't find them listed under abortion pills in medieval texts. Instead, they were called remedies for delayed menstruation, or cleaning herbs. But everyone knew what they meant. Recipes were passed between women, whispered in markets, hidden in the pages of cookbooks. Pennyroyal, rue, tansy, and mugwort, these were the usual suspects. Boiled into teas, ground into powders, or mixed with honey. Some had mild abortive effects. Others were straight-up poison in the wrong doses. Instructions were vague. Measurements were unclear. And when they didn't work, women simply took more. Some cookbooks even had code. A stew for the unsettled belly, or herb water to restore balance. These weren't culinary guides. They were survival manuals. Quiet instructions for how to end a pregnancy when no one else would help. The church, of course, condemned it. But even they couldn't stop it completely. Midwives continued offering herbal solutions. Mothers passed down recipes. In poorer towns it was common knowledge. And among sex workers it was essential. That didn't stop authorities from punishing women caught trying. Accusations of murder. Public shaming. Whipping. In rare cases, execution. But rarely were the men involved ever named. It was always the woman's fault. Her sin, her crime, her body. It's easy now to laugh at the idea of lemon halves and sneezing. But this wasn't funny to them. These women were doing what they could with what little they had. The stakes were survival. The choices were limited. And often the outcome was tragic. And yet, this was life in the Middle Ages. Where sex was everywhere and support was nowhere. If you've made it this far, you're not just curious, you care about the truth. So here's your moment. Hit that subscribe button to support the history scar, because we're not done yet. If you're watching and not subscribing, ask yourself, why? What are you waiting for? In the Middle Ages, a woman's body wasn't hers. Her desire was a mystery. Her pleasure a problem. And if she showed too much of it, that was called madness. One of the most feared labels at the time was hysteria. It wasn't a mental illness as we know it today, it was a catch-all term used to explain almost anything women did that made men uncomfortable. Crying too often. Being too quiet. Laughing at the wrong time. Or worse, wanting sex without permission. The church and early physicians believed that female sexual desire, when not controlled by marriage or religion, led to disease. Real physical sickness. The most popular explanation? The wandering womb. A theory that said a woman's uterus could literally move around her body, like a lost animal, causing shortness of breath, seizures, or even madness. If a woman was anxious, depressed, or simply outspoken, they'd say, "Her womb is climbing." The cure? Get her pregnant. Or if that failed, marry her off and hope her husband fixed it. It gets worse. Female masturbation was considered a sin, and sometimes a sign of demonic possession. If a woman was caught pleasuring herself, she wasn't seen as curious or normal. She was called unnatural. Some were sent to confess. Others to priests for prayer and fasting. A few were handed over to midwives or physicians for what they called treatment. That treatment included herbal sedatives, forced fasting, and in extreme cases, clitoral removal. There are documented cases of women being cut as punishment for overstimulated desires. No anesthesia. No consent. Just fear dressed up as medicine. It didn't end there. In some religious towns, exorcisms were performed on women suspected of being too sexual. Families would call a priest, not a healer. The woman would be tied down. Sacred texts were read aloud. Cold water thrown on her face. All to chase out the so-called demon of lust. None of this was based on fact. But it was taken seriously. Women who refused to marry were at risk. So were widows. So were young girls who asked too many questions. Sometimes, even being seen reading romance poetry was enough to get someone labeled as unstable. There were men affected too. But the obsession was mostly aimed at women, especially those who didn't follow the script. Because if a woman wanted pleasure for herself, she had to be sick. Or sinful. Or both. The truth is, many of these women weren't mad. They were just human. But their humanity was inconvenient to a world run by fear and power. How do you think society would have handled desire if women were actually allowed to enjoy sex? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to see how you process what we've uncovered so far. Because if you think this was the darkest part of medieval sex culture, just wait. The next chapter exposes what happened when men couldn't perform. Not in secret. Not in shame. But in court, under oath, with their manhood on public trial. Keep watching. You've probably seen the image. A heavy metal belt with a lock, sharp edges, and a keyhole no one's supposed to touch. The chastity belt. It's shown in museums, movies, even cartoons. But was it real? The answer is complicated. The idea that medieval women walked around in iron underwear to stay pure sounds like something straight out of a dark fantasy. And in many cases it was. Most of the chastity belts we've seen in collections or books were created in the 1800s, not the Middle Ages. They were made during the Victorian era to reflect their own fears about sexuality, not actual medieval practice. But here's the twist. That doesn't mean the concept was entirely made up. There are a few written references from the late Middle Ages that describe belts or locking garments. Some noble families, especially during long military campaigns or crusades, supposedly used fabric or leather restraints to prevent wives or daughters from engaging in sex. They weren't common. And they weren't always metal. But the fear behind them was real. And in some households, control didn't stop with a belt. There were physical punishments for sexual disobedience. A woman accused of cheating, sometimes even without proof, could be publicly shamed, whipped, or imprisoned. Men caught with other men were burned, castrated, or mutilated depending on local law. Even premarital sex in the wrong town could get you fined, flogged, or worse. Sex was criminalized. And enforcement was often violent. In Italy and parts of France, there were documented cases of women forced to wear locking garments as punishment, not protection. In Germany, tools called shame masks or bridles were used on women accused of lewdness or gossiping about sex. These were iron masks with spikes on the inside, pressing against the face if the wearer tried to speak. Much of what we imagine today comes from artistic exaggeration. Woodcuts, paintings, and satire from centuries later created wild images of belts with spikes, deadly traps, and key holders. But that didn't reflect daily life. It reflected obsession. Still, the core truth remains. Medieval Europe feared uncontrolled sexuality. And that fear led to restraint, humiliation, and pain. This made you squirm? Good. That means you're awake. Subscribe to the History Scar or stay asleep like the rest of them. Because the final chapters of this story go even deeper, into magic, law, and the courtroom battles where sex wasn't just discussed, it was reenacted under supervision. What you're about to hear next is medieval justice at its most intimate. Stay with me. In the Middle Ages, not every pregnancy had a human explanation. Sometimes it wasn't the husband, or the lover, or the stranger in the dark. Sometimes they said it was a demon. People believed the devil had children, and that he made them through women in the real world. That belief shaped real laws, started real trials, and took real lives. The most feared stories came from the beds of sleeping women. It was said that at night, when a woman was alone, a creature called an incubus, a male demon, would enter the room and force itself on her while she slept. If she woke up afraid, sweating, in pain, or pregnant with no clear explanation, people said the demon had been there. Men weren't spared either. If a man claimed he'd had sex in a dream, especially if he woke up visibly shaken or aroused, some believed he'd been seduced by a succubus, a female demon that used sex to steal men's strength or even their souls. In towns hit by famine, plague, or war, these stories became more than folklore. They became evidence. Women who gave birth to children with disabilities or unusual features were accused of sleeping with demons. These babies were sometimes called changeling children, not fully human, touched by evil. Some were taken from their mothers. Others didn't survive. During the height of the witch trials, these beliefs got even darker. Authorities claimed witches could use sex to trap men. That they could charm a man into lust with a glance or a curse. A woman who had too many lovers or too much power or gave birth without a husband could be accused of using black magic to make it happen. And sometimes, it went in the other direction. There were actual cases, written down in trial records, where men were accused of sleeping with demons. These weren't peasants. Some were priests. One man claimed that a spirit in the form of a beautiful woman visited him every night. He confessed under pressure. They branded him a heretic. The story spread for years. The church didn't dismiss these stories. It investigated them. Bishops sent letters. Monks collected confessions. And in some regions, belief in demon sex was used to explain rape, hide affairs, or cover up pregnancies that broke the rules. People didn't always lie out of malice. Sometimes they were desperate. Sometimes they were scared. Sometimes they didn't know any better. In a world that feared women's bodies, feared pleasure, and feared what couldn't be seen, the supernatural became the only explanation that made sense. And it was deadly. Because when you believe the devil can have sex with you, anything that doesn't fit the norm becomes dangerous. That fear gave people permission to punish others for what they couldn't explain. And now that you know that, it's time to hear about what happened when sex wasn't just judged, it was tested in court. Because the next part? It wasn't folklore. It was legal. And it was real. Keep watching. This is the part that will stay with you. Sex wasn't just about desire in the Middle Ages. It was about proof, legality, and sometimes survival. Because in medieval Europe, sex could be taken to court. And it was. Let's start with one of the strangest parts of medieval law, impotence trials. If a woman wanted to leave her husband, she couldn't just ask. Divorce was rare and heavily restricted by the church. But there was one exception, if the man couldn't perform. Not just once. Not just because of nerves. If he was believed to be permanently impotent, the marriage could be annulled. But first he had to prove he wasn't. In court, the process began with medical examinations. Officials, often physicians working with the church, would inspect the man's body. They'd ask about his erections, his sexual habits, how often he tried, and what went wrong. The wife was questioned too. Under oath. She had to describe everything, when, how, what he did or didn't do. If that wasn't enough, they ordered what was called trial by Congress. The couple had to attempt sex in a private room, while medical and legal witnesses stood nearby, sometimes watching through holes in the wall. In other cases, they examined the sheets afterward for evidence. These were not brief procedures. Some couples had to repeat the act multiple times before the court made a decision. And yes, records of these trials survive. Pages and pages of testimony where men defended their manhood in front of strangers, while women described in cold detail how they were left unsatisfied. In many cases, the man lost. If he failed the trial, the marriage was dissolved. The wife was free to remarry. The husband? Often humiliated, sometimes banned from marrying again. And always remembered in public record as impotence. But even outside of divorce, sex had legal weight. Consummation, the act of having sex, was what made a marriage real. Without it, contracts could be cancelled. That meant dowries had to be returned, lands went back to their original owners, and inheritance was blocked. So, families kept records. Contracts were drawn up not just for the marriage, but for the sexual duties that came with it. If the couple didn't fulfill those expectations, the entire agreement was in danger. In some noble houses, witnesses were even asked to testify later, years after the wedding, about what they saw on the wedding night. If no one could confirm the marriage had been consummated, lawsuits followed. The courts weren't just interested in if sex happened, but how well. If the wife claimed the man finished too soon, or couldn't stay hard, or only tried once and gave up, the judges listened. Some cases dragged on for years. With multiple hearings, dozens of witnesses. And in the end, the final judgment often came down to one question. Did the man perform as expected? And then there were the dowry disputes. A woman's virginity once again became a financial matter. If a husband claimed his bride wasn't a virgin and he could prove it, he might demand a partial return of her dowry. In rare cases, women fought back, providing testimony or midwife statements, or challenging the man's own sexual record in response. It was courtroom drama, centuries before lawyers wore suits. Because sex in the Middle Ages wasn't private. It was public business, legal evidence, and political leverage. Your most intimate moments could be read aloud in court, written down by scribes, judged by strangers, and passed into history. And now they're part of yours. This took hundreds of hours of research. If you watched this far and don't subscribe to the History Scar, just tell us why in the comments. Seriously, what more do you want from a channel? Spill it. Tap like. Share this with someone who still thinks the Middle Ages were boring. And if you've made it this far, I'll see you in the next one. Because trust me, there's still more they never told you.